Hello everyone, nice to be back with another video for you today, and this one's going to be a little bit of a talky video, a bit of a rant, as you can probably tell from the title, but don't dislike the video just yet. I want to preface this by saying that I am actually playing a lot of Gwent, the most I have played for several months, and I'm kind of getting back into the game a lot because of the upcoming World Masters tournament, and I took a bit of a break, so now I'm less burnt out and the game is more enjoyable and addictive than it had been, a few months ago. And I do think it's in a pretty interesting state at the moment. A lot of the new cards added, I'm talking about scenarios and also stratagems, the new kind of blue coin mechanic that was added to the game. I think all that stuff's really cool and it adds a lot of faction identity. Especially with scenarios and stratagems, you have each faction has its own kind of theme that it follows. Maybe it's elves that are all popping out when you're on blue coin, or when you have your feigned death trap assembled or whatnot, whether it's machines and Northern Realms. There's a lot of just cool thematic and faction identity kind of boosting ideas there, and I think they're really cool. So I don't want to kind of talk badly about those, but I think it's worth discussing scenarios a little bit, and I'll talk about Radeyah as well, because I think that's also worth mentioning. But yeah, prefacing this by saying I actually quite enjoy the spot that the game is in at the moment, and there's definitely a lot of interesting interactions that go on. There are some more toxic ones that I'll talk about that I don't think are particularly fun, but for the most part, I quite like poison, for example, as a mechanic. I think that creates a lot of really interesting dynamics. It maybe is a bit too binary in how it works, you could argue, but there's definitely positives to that. Anyway, let's get into the discussion, shall we? So I'm going to be focusing on scenarios because I think right now that's the biggest problem. Like a week or two ago, it was Radeyah and Radeyah decks being kind of everywhere. But now it's actually scenarios, and scenarios being everywhere, I think, which is the bigger problem. So what is the issue with scenarios? Well, here they are. They are some of the highest provision cards in the game, as you can probably realize. If we look at all the cards here, the scenarios are amongst the most expensive cards for most factions, and they also get a lot more value than similar, costed cards. For the most part, stuff like Draug is maybe an exception, or Regis or whatever, right? But thinking like, okay, a card like Old Spear Tip, which has been power crept a lot and is no longer very good. This guy's a 12-14. That seems quite bad, right? You don't even get the full provision cost. Now, in the past, gold cards and high provision cards especially used to be kind of balanced around the fact that the higher provision something is, the less kind of actual value it should give you for the provisions. And the reason for that is it kind of lowers the discrepancy between bronze and gold cards, right? If you have bronze cards that are able to achieve a point threshold above the provision cost that they cost, and the gold cards are getting similar to their provision cost, or maybe even a bit less, then the kind of difference between golds and bronzes is smaller, which means the difference between whether you draw very well or draw very badly, i.e. the variance, the luck factor in the games is lower. So I think that was the design philosophy before. Having less sort of concentrated power in one or two cards is generally a good thing, right? Because less games are going to be decided on whether you just draw that card or whether you have an answer for that card, or etc, etc. So that's how cards were being designed before, it seems like. Either you had something like Spear Tip, which is kind of equal on points provisions or a little bit less, or you have cards like Regis, which are very, very situational. Those are the two conditions. Very situational cards and cards that break even-ish, to get the points. Rather than, cards like Oak, which kind of came into the game, and, you can argue Oak is fine because you need a reasonably long round to get the 13 for 13. That's fair, but yeah, we're talking about scenarios, and scenarios I think cross the line a little bit on what these high provision golds should be able to do. Scenarios have so many points, basically focused, concentrated into one card. You're effectively able to play 3 bronze cards with a Masquerade Ball or a Siege. So you're playing a 3-for-1 card, effectively. If you compare this to drawing a bronze card, and you assume the Masquerade Ball will get full value, then you're playing 3 bronzes instead of 1. So basically, yeah, the draw RNG is very high, when these cards are in the game and when you're playing them in your decks, right? The difference between drawing this and drawing just one bronze compared to 3 bronzes effectively is a huge difference, potentially deciding a lot of games. Now that's not a huge problem because we have, consistency cards like Matter, which actually, work around that issue. A lot of decks have ways to guarantee they draw their scenario and don't fall prey to draw RNG. However, that in itself might be a problem because it means a lot of decks are focusing on playing a scenario. In fact, let's take a look at this deck by Azekov, for example, which is, I'm sure you've seen it at this point, it's Nilfgaard, and you play the Masquerade Ball, and then you have a Sire to actually replay it. There are also decks which play Caretaker, even maybe Renew on Caretaker in Northern Realms, and are focused around that one card and replaying it, of course, as many times as you can. So what is the issue with this? Well, basically the strength of this card, it's allowing you to play so many points, potentially 20 plus points from a 14 provision card. It's just like so good that you kind of have to play it, right? And when you have ways to recycle it, it means you're not super vulnerable to the counters, i.e. artifact removal, so there's less risk associated with playing this card. So while it is a situational card, it kind of loses the situational nature of it. The only kind of situational thing about it is that it can be removed by artifact removal, but that's not a huge concern if you have ways to resurrect or reuse the artifact, or even ways to protect it, or, as a lot of decks do, play 2 cards in one turn and get the value from the scenario before artifact removal can even come down. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of ways to actually circumvent the situational nature of a scenario, getting its full value, which is that you maybe get artifact removed, right? And when there's ways to circumvent that, it means these cards aren't really situational, so they end up just being equivalent to something like Spear Tip, but with way more points, all concentrated into one, and in fact, not even concentrated in the same way Spear Tip is, where it's just one body, but you get multiple bodies, you get multiple effects, you get all sorts of crazy shenanigans, engine cards, situational things that can help you out, like poison and stuff like that. So what I'm saying is, they're just very, very strong, and the situational aspect of the card that should make them weaker is not really there, because you have leaders which play 2 cards in a turn, you have Radeyah for Scoia'tael who can proc your Feign Death, you have ways to reuse the scenario. If you can't tell at this point, scenarios are basically the card that is abused by many, many decks, and there's ways to, deal with the opponent's running artifact removal. Now that's the other thing, everyone is, well, for the most part, running artifact removal in some form. Bomb Heaver is a staple in many, many decks, or Yen's Invocation, of course, in Nilfgaard. And I think that has a really detrimental effect on the game. Bomb Heaver is a 5p card, as you're probably aware, and it destroys an artifact. So this little guy, if he kills the artifact before it actually goes crazy, before anything happens, you get a really good trade, right? 5 provisions trading with 14 or 12 or whatever, and effectively 1-for-1 on the amount of points you get. That's a really, really good trade, and it's so good, in fact, that it can be game deciding quite a lot of the time. Now, a lot of situations that I've seen occurring, basically, the scenario being played in round 1. If you play it in round 1, particularly on red coin, when you're going second, you have the opportunity to kind of bully your opponent out of the round. You don't have to risk them having some kind of artifact removal later in the game. And obviously this depends on the matchup and the player as to whether they're going to do this or not, but a lot of the time maybe you see the scenario come down in round 1, they maybe have a way to reuse it later on, with things like Nilfgaard or Northern Realms or whatever, and scenario gets played, it either generates a lot of points or it gets artifact removed, and this is where the problem happens, right? Because if it gets removed by the artifact, that's a very bad trade for the person who played the scenario. So effectively these round 1 situations can boil down to draw Bomb Heaver or don't draw Bomb Heaver, and then that can be game deciding on its own, potentially. just because if that trade happens, you're maybe playing a game 10 provisions down from what you should be playing it, right? So I think that's the biggest issue, is that kind of luck factor of, did the opponent draw their bomb heaver? Should I play my artifact now? Should I save it for later? You kind of have to play a guessing game, really, really big gambles, and just hope that they didn't draw their thing, or you have to hope that you draw your bomb heaver, etc. Now, there's another aspect to this sort of randomness and gambling factor that comes in, which I'm not a huge fan of, because it just feels like a little bit too much luck-based and not enough, thinking and skill required. Although you could argue that gambling in some sense requires skill. But yeah, that next point is that since people have incorporated a lot of ways in their decks to circumvent artifact removal, you have to gamble on them having a scenario, and then you also have to gamble on them having a way to circumvent your artifact removal. So a lot of times you'll have a bomb heaver in hand, for example, and you maybe have to mulligan it away because there's a chance they can activate their scenario all in one turn, leaving your counter to their card actually not a counter, and in fact a dead card in your hand. So there's an aspect of gambling in terms of, does my opponent play a scenario or not, and then you have to just completely take a risk on that. And then you have to gamble again in terms of whether they have a way to reuse their artifact. Maybe you should play a Radeyah on bomb heaver to get 2 bomb heavers so they can't play another one, but maybe they don't play another one and you just played a bad Radeyah, etc. And yeah, so basically there's a lot of gambling involved with the scenarios. You have to take a risk and just hope that you're right, and there's no real there's no real knowing in a lot of those situations how the game's going to turn out, and you can say to some extent when people are net decking that maybe there is a more correct line, but the fact remains that a lot of these decks don't have to reuse or don't have to kind of deploy their scenario all in one turn. They can, leave it on the board and leave it vulnerable to artifact removal. So, like, the artifact removal player is left in a really vulnerable spot, having to gamble, on whether or not they should keep their artifact removal or even look for it. If that makes sense. I'm kind of going with very, a lot of words here, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to say. So I just think artifact removal as a way to deal with the scenarios is kind of a really unfun way, an unfun mechanic for both players. It's creating these really binary situations where you either win big time or lose big time in a lot of cases. And yeah, both players are gambling and risking without really having any idea of what the correct play is, and it's kind of all coming down to luck and random factors, which I don't think is a very fun kind of, gameplay pattern. So we've seen this problem before with artifacts, and I think, to be honest, artifacts and their implementation, I already did a video on this, which you can check out if you would like, about artifacts and their design, and I think, I just think they're kind of a flawed concept and failed in their implementation. And that's kind of evidenced by, just how many artifacts that have been overpowered in some way and have had to be changed over the course of the game. You're thinking things like spears, the shields, and all that no unit nonsense that came about. You've got Summoning Circle, which is just bonkers. You now got scenarios. It seems like quite often the artifacts are promoting some really, I would argue, unhealthy and toxic kind of gameplay loops, and often they're having to get changed because of that. And I think that's just because artifacts and artifact removal and the way those two things interact is inherently flawed and needs to change in some way. There have been a lot of solutions given in the past, maybe, and I think even CDPR have said they've been thinking about this themselves and toying with the idea of maybe making artifacts immune to everything, no artifact removal in the game, etc. Or maybe there's some granularity you can add to removing them and whatnot, but yeah, anyway, how do we fix the scenario problem right now? Because I'm not too sure that a rework of all artifacts and artifact removal is going to happen anytime soon, and I'm not sure that it would even be the best solution at this point. I do kind of like, of course, how scenarios work. I already mentioned that I think they're very cool thematically. For faction identity, I think they're really very nice, and they're just fun cards to play. You play a card, your deck synergizes, you have a lot of cool stuff going on with them. Now, I think the main problem with them is that they spawn engines, and I'll tell you why this is a problem. So if a scenario actually creates an engine card, a long-term value card that needs to get answered, or it generates value. When you play that card, you effectively play 2 cards in one play that need to be answered, right? Because they need to deal with your Masquerade Ball, for example, and they need to deal with your Thirsty Dane. They've got to kill 2 cards in one play, and maybe that's hard to do. That requires either a leader of some kind or whatever. But then you add on the fact that you can often play another card with your scenario, so then you're just throwing out like multiple threats potentially, which all have to get answered in the same turn. Now this is kind of a similar problem which has been seen with things like Mystic Echo and just the prevalence of Scoia'tael being so strong, because you can play like a bunch of engines in the same turn, and you can't really have all of those things be answered by the opponent very easily. Basically, overwhelming your opponent with threats that they have to deal with, because those threats are quite binary in how many points they gain, whether they're answered or not, that can create just kind of very, very powerful and very, unfair feeling cards like scenarios. So that's kind of the main issue, I think, with them, is the engine value and the situational card value like Poison. I think these scenarios should only be spawning, cards that have a fixed value, that can't go crazy wild. If the Masquerade Bull could gain a maximum of 14, 15, 16 points, I don't think anyone would really complain too much about it, right? But the problem is when it's gaining 20 plus points, or when, Northern Realms plays all their machines and then they can wipe your whole board with the damage and whatnot. Like, I think these cards should really just be playing pure point values, and then they can be balanced very easily, right? So, take for example, maybe it plays a Nilfgaardian Knight and a Tortoise guy, and this is going to be like a maximum of, 16, 17 points if everything goes great for you. And there's still some situational stuff and planning and thinking about how you use this scenario. There can still be thematic aspects to it, but, without that crazy engine and situational value that you get right now in pretty much all of the artifacts that exist. I'm not really sure why they spawn engine cards. I think that was maybe just a very silly design decision, to be honest, when designing these artifacts. But yeah, I don't think this solution is very likely to happen. Just because you'd have to rework all of the cards, and kind of, I'm not sure they'd work very well thematically. Masquerade Bull spawning big soldiers probably doesn't make much sense, and likewise, it might be difficult to do that for other factions as well. But probably the solution they're going to go with, I guess, if they consider scenarios to be a problem, is they'll just nerf the provision cost, right? They'll increase the provision cost. I think this is a terrible solution. This is like, I'm trying to think of an analogy, but basically, you're making a situation that's bad kind of worse by trying to fix it. So you have 2 options if they nerf the provision cost of these cards, right? Option number 1 is these cards never see play again. That's quite sad because they're very cool and thematic and whatnot, and they incentivize cool deck building and etc. The other option is that these cards are still quite good and still played, maybe a lot, maybe not a lot, but their infuriating factor, the kind of frustration and annoyance that they cause is increased because the provision cost is increased, meaning they're even a larger percentage of your deck focused into one card, right? And that means that, again, artifact removal, whether they get removed or not, just becomes even more of a big deal. And whether you draw them or not, if you're playing them, becomes even more of a big deal. So basically, if you increase the provision cost, you either remove them from seeing play at all, which is quite a sad thing to do, or they end up being even more kind of luck dependent in terms of the value that they can get, and just infuriating to kind of play and deal with in general, right? So I think that solution is going to be a pretty bad one, and probably what they're going to go with. So, you can then have the discussion on whether artifacts in general should be changed, and artifact removal and how it all works, and maybe that's a discussion that needs revisiting. The other thing to talk about is Radeyah, and Radeyah is a bit of a weird one. I kind of like how the card works. I like that it allows everyone to be playing their stratagems another time, or once if they're not on red coin, right? I do think stratagems are very cool. They add faction identity again, so Radeyah is kind of adding to that and making the game feel a little bit more like Gwent, like how Gwent should feel, I feel. But I think the problem with Radeyah is, starting deck having no duplicates. That incentivizes some pretty Dumbo, Singleton decks, and I've never been a fan of Shoop because it decreases the sort of consistency and synergy within your deck. If you're playing Shoop, you have to play a bunch of random bronzes which don't really work well together, and it kind of is, again, focusing a lot of your deck's power in one or two cards, which creates problems with draw, RNG, and all that stuff, and just abuse of these cards when you try to replay Radeyah or use it in conjunction with other cards that are very strong, like Anse's and Feign Death. So Radeyah probably deserves a bit of a nerf. I would like to actually see Radeyah receive a nerf, but get rid of this starting deck having no duplicates condition. I think it's actually just toxic for the game to have a viable and cool card with that condition. I don't think Highlander or one copy card decks should be incentivized, because I don't think they're very interesting decks to play. And especially the more cards that get introduced, the stronger they become, and also the less interesting they become, because these kind of decks can just play a bunch of just good value cards that don't work well together. So I think they should get rid of this condition, but maybe decrease the points, increase the provisions, for example, something like that. And then maybe you see Radeyah in a few decks that can use it well, like maybe with Anse's, and it's kind of a cool little combo, but it doesn't make everyone play Singleton decks where they feel like it's appropriate, and therefore there's more synergy in the game, more kind of fun decks out there, and less of the craziness that we see at the moment. So I guess that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about today in terms of scenarios. Radeyah, I probably didn't say everything that I wanted to, but there's not always time in a video like this to do that. But generally, I think the game's in a decent spot in terms of poison. You can have a talk about poison as well in terms of whether poison is too good. It feels like there has been a lot of power creep going on the past few expansions. I kind of missed a little bit of it because I took a bit of a break, but a lot of power creep on bronzes, on golds. It feels like bronzes nowadays are only good if they're poisoning something, which is pretty funny, but that's another discussion to be had for another day, I suppose. Let me know what you think about scenarios and Radeyah down in the comments. Let me know if you think my solutions are okay. They're probably clunky and not going to happen, so whatever. But it will be interesting to see what happens in the future with these cards. Maybe they won't even get changed and we'll be living in a bomb heaver meta for some time, but who knows. Anyway, that'll be me done for today. Thanks a lot for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye.